Chapter 8. "Hold on a second," I said, and David paused before his next hatchet strike. We were switching back and forth repeatedly, whenever one of us got tired. I reached up and with both hands grabbed the splintered remains of a board. I wiggled it back and forth and then twisted and pulled, and it came free in my hands. I held it out, showing it off to David and Susie as though I had just won a prize. Susie didn't look over. She was just staring at the water below, not moving, shaking from the cold. I wanted her to see that we were making progress, no matter how slow it was. I dropped the piece of wood and it splashed into the water, joining the rest of the flotsam of the McBride's house. I reached up again to see if I could free another piece, and my hand touched something soft, not wood. I pushed and it gave way. It was the shingle. We'd broken through the roof. "Give me the hatchet," I ordered. I took it from David and pushed the blade against the shingle. It split open. I handed the hatchet back to David and grabbed the shingle, ripping it away. Immediately, a little puff of fresh air came through the opening. I breathed it deeply into my lungs. It was cool and fresh and moist, and so different from the stale air we'd been inhaling for the past few hours. "Susie, turn off the flashlight." She didn't move. She didn't react. "Susie," David yelled, his voice bouncing off the roof and startling Susie back to attention. "Turn off the light, now." Everything became dark, and then not so dark. A shaft of light was coming through the hole we'd created. Dim, growing wider as it fell from the roof, but it was light. More than that, it was a sign, a signal, a beacon. It meant that we just had to continue doing what we'd been doing, and that it was possible, that we could chop through the roof. After working for what seemed like hours with no sign of success, this was like a shot of adrenaline. I knew we could do it. I'd give it one tremendous shot and I'd open that hole up wider. I figured this would be just like opening up a can. The hardest part was getting it started. I drew my arm back and the blade of the hatchet slipped off the handle, bounced off one of the beams, and plopped into the water, instantly sinking out of the view. I stood there stunned, looking at the useless wooden handle in my hand. Then I looked at David, and back to the water where the blade had fallen, back to the handle, finally stopping at David again. My whole body began to shake, and I started to cry. I had really believed we could do it, make it out, but now... David jumped to his feet. For a split second, I thought he was going to hit me because of what I'd done. Instead, he wrapped his arms around me. "I'm so sorry," I sobbed. "I didn't mean it. It just slipped off. It was an accident." "It's okay." "It's not okay. We need it. I'll go down and get it," I said. That thought was terrifying. The blade would be almost 8 feet underwater, somewhere. "No, you don't have to," David said. "You're going to go?" I asked hopefully. He pointed down at the 2x4s. We were studying medieval castles, and I read about how they used to break down those gigantic wooden doors. They used a battering ram. He wiggled one of the 2x4s out from under the edge of the platform, picked it up, and aimed it up at the roof. He drew it back and then slammed it against the roof. He did that a second time, and then a third. On the third blow, there was a loud crack, and a piece of wood shot up into the air. The hole doubled in size. "What if we both hold and swing it together?" I asked. Before he could answer, one way or another, I took hold of the 2x4 as well, putting one hand below and one hand above his. "Ready?" David said. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. We swung the board up and it smashed into the roof with a tremendous crash, cracking another piece off the roof. The impact reverberated through my arms and right down to my legs, and it hurt my hands where they had slid forward. None of that mattered. Again, there was another crack, but this time the end of the board cracked as well. "Turn it over," David said. We worked it around so that we had another new, solid side to ram with. We hit it again and again and again, working into a rhythm. Some of the blows seemed to have no effect, while others caused cracks and crunches and chunks of wood to fly out or fall down. "Hold on," I said, and I released my grip on the 2x4. My hands were numb and sore and cut and bleeding, but I didn't care. I wiped them on my pants and reached up and grabbed the shingles that were hanging limply. I ripped off a big chunk and then a second. There was more light and air and rain. I could feel it on my face. It was still raining, but not heavily. The hole was so much bigger now. Was it big enough? "Give me a boost," I said. David put down the 2x4 and clasped his hands together. I grabbed onto the rough edge of the roof, put up a foot into David's bridged hands, and then jumped. I bumped my shoulder against one side, but with David pushing me from below and me pulling, I popped out. I reached out and grabbed the television antenna, which was just above the hole. I used it to pull myself up and out until I was just sitting on the edge of the hole, my legs hanging down and inside. "What do you see?" David demanded. I'd been so focused on getting out that I hadn't looked any further than the antenna. Mostly what I saw was water foaming, boiling, bubbling, raging water everywhere. We were in the very middle of an angry river, and I couldn't even see the banks on either side. Just downstream, there had been a line of big trees that marked the edge of the McBride's property line. They were all gone, except for one large tree and a few smaller ones that had somehow managed to survive. I leaned down so I could be heard. We're in the middle of the river. I don't see shore in any direction, but it's dark. Maybe it's just past the houses on the other side of the street. I'll look again. I twisted around, holding on carefully, and peered into the distance again, hoping that maybe I would see something. Sticking out of the river were little islands, the houses of Raymore Drive. Trapped inside this house, I'd almost forgotten that we weren't the only house, the only people going through this. But where were those other people now? Had they gotten out before it was too late? Or were they trapped in their houses still? Or had they been caught by the current and swept away? I couldn't see anybody. I couldn't even see lights coming from any of the houses. The sky above was dark, and the stars and moon obscured by the thick clouds. The rain was still falling, but it was just a drizzle. There were bursts of lightning? No, they were coming from the hills, from the edges of the valley. There were beams of light above the river. There were people up there, looking down, trying to find us, find anybody caught in the river. If they could see us, at least people, our parents, would know we were still alive. I was below the peak of the roof. If I wanted to be seen, or if I wanted to see what was on the other side of the house, the upstream part of the house, I'd have to scale the roof and get to the top. "I'm going to try to climb to the peak," I called down to David. "Wait, I'll come up and do it." "No, you need to stay with Susie." "Hurry, the water's almost at the platform now." His voice had an edge of fear. I felt the roof with my hand. It was cold and slick and, of course, wet. The rain wasn't falling hard, but it was still dripping down from the shingles. I put one foot on the edge of the hole, and the jagged wood dug in through my soaked sock and into my foot. Bizarrely, I thought about my new saddle shoes and wondered if they were still downstairs somewhere. I was better off without them right now anyway. I'd be better off without the socks too. My feet certainly couldn't get much colder. I reached down and pulled off one sock and then the other. My bare feet would give me a better grip. I pushed off with one foot, pulled on the antenna, reached up to the very peak, and tried to hoist myself up, sliding up a little and then slipping back down. The wet roof was as slick as ice. What would we hold on to? How could we all find footing out here? Now that we could get out to the roof, it was obvious that we should stay inside as long as possible. But how much longer was that? I looked up at the peak again. Maybe if we could get to the top, to the peak, we could straddle it, with one leg on each side. That might work. I had to see if that was possible. I dug my foot into the edge of the hole so I could stand up. Next, I stepped up so that my other foot was wedged between the roof and the antenna. I pulled myself up and then reached up and grabbed the peak. I pushed off, pulled, and prayed that my head and shoulders and part of my body slipped over the top. I'd made it. I dug my toes in on one side and my fingers on the other. I threw one arm back and was able to grab the peak again and pull myself around. Now I was straddling the roof, riding it like a pony, but safely, securely sitting. I'd done it. Right beside the McBride's house was the Watson place, or at least that was where it should have been. It wasn't there. No, that couldn't be right. A house didn't just go away. Wait, the Watsons' house was a bungalow. It wasn't gone. It was completely underwater. But what had happened to the Watsons? They hadn't driven out that much, I knew, because I'd seen their car being carried down the river. Had they somehow managed to escape before the waters got too deep? Before their house was submerged? Or had they... I stopped myself from thinking any further. I didn't know the name of the family that lived in the next house, but I knew them to see them. Their house sat looking like what I imagined ours looked like. A little peaked shadow rising out of the water. Wait, what was that on the roof? There was something on the roof, at the very peak. No, not something. Somebody. 2 or 3 figures were straddling the roof the same way I was. One of them started waving. They'd seen me. I waved my arms over my head, and all 3 waved back wildly. I felt relief and a little rush of happiness. Not only were we not alone, but I knew that at least some other people had survived. That was it. I had to get David and Susie up here. I waved goodbye to them and carefully slipped one leg back over the peak, keeping enough of my body over the other side to counterbalance. Slowly, I lowered myself down, trying and failing to grip with my toes. I was extended as far as I could reach. Either I pulled myself back up, or I let go. There was no choice. I slid down, reaching for the antenna with my hands and feeling for the hole with my feet. My toes jammed into the edge of the hole, but that didn't stop me. I slipped past the hole and I grabbed onto it with my arms and held on. Head first, I clawed my way into the hole and, "Elizabeth, you're okay," David yelled. He reached up and grabbed my hands, pulling me farther in. I fell forward into his arms and into water. Water, only a few inches deep. How could that be possible? Oh my God, the water had risen above the beams. We were standing on the platform, but it was now beneath the water. Susie threw her arms around me and started sobbing. "We were calling and you weren't answering," David screamed. "I couldn't hear anything because of the noise of the river. I'm sorry. We thought you were gone." "Gone? Where would I go?" Then I understood what he meant. They were afraid I'd been swept down the river. "We have to get out," David said. "It's rising fast. Is there a place for us up there?" "There is." I looked down at Daisy standing on the platform in the water, shivering and whining. There was a way for us, but was there for Daisy? She looked so woeful. I knew we couldn't just leave her here. We had to try and get her up and onto the roof. Maybe we could hold on to her. "Give me a boost again. I'll go first. Then help Susie up, and once I make sure she's safe, I'll come back and we'll move Daisy. You're last." David didn't argue with my plan. He gave me a boost. It was much easier the second time. I pulled myself free and then spun around so I was hanging in the hole. I reached down and David was already holding Susie up, her arms reaching toward me. I grabbed her by one wrist, my other hand holding the antenna. She was so light and so little that with David pushing and me pulling, she came up with ease. I put her down on the edge of the hole, next to the antenna. She clung to my arm. "You're going to go up there," I said, "to the peak. It'll be fine." She nodded, her head wide-eyed. "First, you climb up to the antenna. I need you to put both feet right there." She nodded her head, and I held her hand and steadied her as she stepped up. She rested her second foot against the first, but she was fine there. Next, I lay down on the roof with my feet firmly on the edge of the hole, so my body formed a ladder, extending up past the antenna toward the roof. "Climb on top of me, like a ladder, and get to the top," I yelled. She landed on top of me with a thud, her hands wrapped tightly against my throat, and her elbows and knees dug into me as her feet clawed for grip against my body. "You're doing great, Susie," I yelled. I needed to encourage her. "Keep climbing," I yelled, trying not to move. She moved further up until she was laying on the roof above me, her feet firmly on my shoulders. "When you get to the top, throw one leg over the peak so you're riding the house." She reached up, and at the same time, I reached up with one hand and pushed against the sole of her foot, giving her a final boost. She reached the top and settled there, straddling the roof. "Stay right there," I yelled. Now it was Daisy's turn. I slipped back down so my feet were dangling into the hole. I leaned into the hole and back into the house. "Next comes the dog," I said. "No, we don't have to. Not yet. Watch." David stepped off to the side, off the plywood platform, and onto what had to be a rafter beneath the water. The little piece of plywood with Daisy on top wobbled and then started to float. "She's okay for a while. Let me come up and look first." I took the belt off my pants and made it into a leash for Daisy. "See?" He aimed the flashlight at Daisy. His belt was around her neck. David tucked the flashlight into his pocket. The light was still shining, but it was almost all blocked by the material of his pants. He jumped up and grabbed the edge of the hole. I grabbed a handful of his shirt and helped pull him up and out. He got to his knees and then rose to his feet. "The big trees are all gone," he gasped, pointing downstream. No, there's still one. I turned around. The one big tree that had been there was gone. In the few minutes that had passed, it had been swept away by the river. All that remained were the smaller trees, their top branches barely above the waves, but swaying and swinging and bouncing as the current hit against them. How could the little ones survive when the bigger, thicker trees were swept away? David said. That doesn't make any sense. No, I said, shaking my head. The big trees couldn't bend. They stood against the current and tried to fight it. It broke them. The little trees don't fight. They bend and sway and let the current push them around. That's why they haven't been broken. I guess that makes sense, he said. But forget about the trees, I said. Let's concentrate on getting up on the roof. Since you're up here, you might as well go all the way to the peak. You should go first, David said. No, I'm taller, and it's easier for me to reach. Besides, you're the one who's going to have to pull Daisy up once I get her out. David grabbed the antenna. Then he wedged his foot against it and pulled himself up to the peak. He sat down right in front of Susie, facing toward her. She wrapped her arms around him in a big hug. She was cold and scared. We were all cold and scared. I would have loved to join them up there, but I couldn't. I have to wait with Daisy, hoping the water didn't rise any higher. How many times had I hoped that and been disappointed? It was going to rise, and we'd have to get to the top of the roof. And where would we go from there? There was no place left to climb. We reached the top of the mountain, and there was no more up. I suddenly felt a wave of exhaustion. I sat down on the edge of the hole. My feet were so numb, I didn't realize that they were now half submerged. I looked down. Daisy was floating just beneath me. If I didn't bring her out right now, the water would rise above the hole, and she'd be trapped. I reached down and grabbed the dog by the scruff of her neck and heaved her up. She was wet and heavy and struggled against me. I banged her against the roof and continued to pull until she popped out. Her claws scraped desperately against the shingle, getting no grip. What now? I heaved her up so that her two front legs were on one side of the antenna and her back two legs on the other. I pushed against her with all my weight, pinning her in place against the roof. She continued to struggle, and I pressed against her until she finally stopped. I looked up. David was watching what was happening, but he was helpless to do anything. I took the belt, the leash, in one hand and held it up over my head. I was going to toss it up and hope he could grab the end. I threw it, and David reached out, but it wasn't long enough. David lowered himself down. His legs were on the other side of the peak, and he stretched, reaching out his arms toward me and Daisy. I threw the belt up, and he caught it. He began pulling, and I pushed from below. Daisy struggled, unable to resist, but unable to help us either. Her claws scraped uselessly against the shingles. David pulled, and I pushed until she was above my outreached arms. There was only a foot or so to go. David hauled her up further, and the belt suddenly snapped. Daisy slid down, right past me. I tried to grab her, but she bounced off my fingertips and splashed down into the river. She disappeared from view under the water, and then resurfaced a dozen feet away, facing us, desperately swimming, her paws digging into the water, trying to swim back toward the house, but being swept further and further away. Finally, she disappeared into the darkness.